it. You know what I mean? This is nothing. It bothers me. It bothers me that it's such a point of contention because they will figure that part out. That is something that will be figured out. Now, with these reports, there have also been rumors that the players might actually strike during NBA All-Star Weekend, but I want to point out to you guys something that the WNBA posted on.
To explain their position and rally public understanding, the Players Association has drawn a historical comparison that resonates strongly in sports labor history, the 1964 NBA All-Star Game strike. In that incident, players refused to participate moments before tip-off of a nationally televised event, forcing league leadership to address their demands immediately. The move is often remembered as a turning point that helped establish stronger labor rights for professional basketball players. Today's NBA, with its global reach and highly compensated athletes, looks drastically different from that earlier era. Back then, conditions were far less glamorous. Many players traveled under cramped circumstances, stayed in modest accommodations, and lacked the protections modern contracts provide. There were fewer guarantees, limited bargaining power, and minimal influence over scheduling or working conditions. By sharing that historical narrative on social media, the WNBA appears to be drawing a symbolic line between past and present, suggesting that transformative change often requires decisive collective action. The comparison is powerful because it frames the current situation as more than a routine negotiation. It casts it as a potential milestone, a moment when players could reshape their economic relationship with the league. For supporters, that framing is inspiring, reminding them that rights many athletes enjoy today exist because earlier generations were willing to take risks. However, historical parallels are never perfect. Circumstances differ across eras, leagues, and economic landscapes. Some analysts point out that while the symbolism is strong, the strategic environment today is not identical to 1964. Media contracts, sponsorship structures, and league calendars all influence how much leverage a work stoppage might generate at any given time. Still, symbolism matters. By invoking that earlier strike, the union is shaping how fans interpret the present moment. Instead of seeing negotiations as routine business, supporters may view them as part of a broader narrative about fairness, recognition, and progress. That reframing alone can influence public sentiment, which in turn can indirectly affect negotiations by shifting the climate of opinion surrounding them.
A counter-proposal to the WNBA. Now, like we talked about last week, the two sides met in person, and the WNBA was surprised that the WNBA didn't come with any sort of revised proposal for them during that meeting. So the league was like, hey, we'll work on it. And so they did come back with something, and the first to report it was Sports Business Journal. It says WNBA's latest revenue share offer doesn't exceed 15%, but the league does bend on housing and facility standards. So the latest CBA proposal was submitted.
If you look closely at what the league did modify in its proposal, the adjustments centered largely on benefits rather than revenue percentage. Housing provisions became one of the most discussed elements. The offer reportedly included one-bedroom apartments for players earning minimum salaries who have 0 years of service, though only for a limited window spanning 2026 through 2028. Developmental players, under that same framework, would receive studio apartments. On paper, those are tangible benefits, real living accommodations that reduce out-of-pocket costs for athletes early in their careers. Supporters of the proposal argue that such measures show the league is trying to improve quality of life conditions, particularly for players at the lower end of the pay scale. Housing can be a significant expense, especially for athletes who relocate frequently or maintain residences in multiple cities. Providing apartments could offer stability and financial relief, which is why leagues in various sports sometimes include similar benefits in collective agreements. However, reactions from some player representatives suggest these concessions don't address what they see as the core issue. From their standpoint, housing improvements are secondary compared to the broader question of revenue distribution. They view the debate less as a matter of perks and more as a matter of economic structure. In that framework, benefits like apartments can feel peripheral, appreciated, perhaps, but not decisive. Critics of the proposal's emphasis on housing say focusing heavily on that topic risks diverting attention from the financial split players have identified as their priority. To them, it can appear as though negotiators are discussing details around the edges rather than the centerpiece of the dispute. Advocates for the league's approach counter that negotiations often proceed step by step, with agreements on smaller items building momentum toward resolving larger ones. This difference in interpretation highlights a classic bargaining dynamic. One side may present incremental improvements as evidence of progress, while the other views them as insufficient until foundational demands are addressed. Neither interpretation is inherently wrong, they simply reflect different strategic perspectives. Still, when public statements emphasize contrasting priorities, it reinforces the sense that both sides are still far apart rather than inching closer together.
Sources told Sports Business Journal it was always less than 15%, and that Friday night's offer similarly did not surpass that number. So basically, it seems like the league came back to them, changed some other things that I feel like are things that could be easily negotiated. We've talked about it in previous episodes. They changed some of those things, and they maybe budged like 1% on the revenue split. And what we've been hearing from all the players is if they do not budge on the revenue split.
For many players, the issue has become deeply personal because they've consistently framed their stance in clear, uncompromising terms. Their message has been that movement on secondary topics won't matter until the revenue split itself changes. In other words, they're not primarily negotiating for upgraded travel arrangements, enhanced facilities, or additional amenities. Those things might be welcome, but they're not the centerpiece. The centerpiece, from their perspective, is a structural shift in how league income is divided between ownership and athletes. Their reported benchmark, roughly 30% of gross revenue along with a substantially higher salary cap, represents what they see as a fair reflection of the league's growth and their role in generating it. Setting a specific figure also serves a strategic purpose. In negotiations, a clearly defined target can unify a group internally, ensuring members understand exactly what they're aiming for. It prevents ambiguity and reduces the chance of internal disagreement about acceptable outcomes. When the league's response arrived after weeks of waiting and appeared close to its earlier stance, some players interpreted that as a signal rather than just a number. In their view, it suggested the league was not yet ready to reconsider its valuation model. Whether or not that interpretation reflects the league's intent, perception again plays a powerful role. Negotiations often hinge not only on proposals but on what those proposals seem to communicate about respect, recognition, and priorities. From the league's standpoint, maintaining a cautious position may reflect financial realities, long-term planning, or risk management. Professional sports leagues must balance player compensation with operating costs, expansion strategies, and investor expectations. Even so, when one side feels its contributions aren't fully reflected in the offer, frustration can intensify quickly. That's why the tone of this phase feels sharper than earlier stages. It's no longer just about numbers on a spreadsheet, it's about what those numbers symbolize. For players, they represent acknowledgement of their value. For the league, they represent sustainability. Until those two interpretations overlap, progress tends to remain slow.
The players are saying, we're not budging until you give us this gross revenue split of 30%. The league is offering a net revenue split of 70%. And the league took 6 weeks to respond to this, and it doesn't seem like they changed too much. And Alexa Filippo tweeted about the changes to housing, and the WNBA's latest proposal included some concessions on housing. 1 bedrooms would be available for players on their applicable minimum salary, and with 0 years of service, 2026 to 2028 only. Developmental players would get studio apartments. No significant updates on rev share. I feel like I've said about housing, I'm tired of hearing.
5 days before the public ever saw the statement that's now dominating headlines, the WNBPA quietly posted something on Instagram that, in hindsight, looked less like a history lesson and more like a signal flare. At first glance it seemed educational, a collaboration post highlighting the famous 1964 NBA All-Star Game strike, when players refused to take the court until their demands were acknowledged. But the real weight of that post wasn't in the archival photos or captions explaining the past. It was in the final 8 words that didn't reference history at all but instead pointed squarely at the present. Today, the WNBPA is ready to strike for the first time. Those words didn't sound speculative. They didn't suggest a possibility or float a hypothetical. They sounded deliberate, calculated, and timed. Anyone experienced in labor negotiations knows language matters, and unions rarely choose phrases like that casually. Ready to strike carries a very different tone than considering options or keeping all possibilities open. It signals preparation, unity, and willingness to escalate if discussions stall. In other words, it was less of a warning and more of a declaration that patience had limits. At the time of that post, negotiations had already stretched for weeks without visible breakthroughs. Publicly, both sides maintained the usual diplomatic language about ongoing discussions and mutual respect. But behind that polished tone, tension was clearly building. Players had been emphasizing their desire for structural change, especially around revenue distribution, while league leadership appeared focused on incremental adjustments rather than sweeping reforms. The Instagram message suddenly reframed the situation. What looked like slow negotiations now looked like a ticking clock. Observers who follow sports labor history recognized the symbolism immediately. Referencing the 1964 NBA strike wasn't random nostalgia, it was strategic storytelling. That event is remembered as a turning point when players forced recognition of their collective voice. By invoking it, the WNBPA was aligning its current fight with a moment widely seen as courageous and transformative. It suggested the union viewed its position not as routine bargaining, but as a defining crossroads. And now, 6 weeks into talks with little progress visible to the public, that one subtle message feels louder. Each passing day without agreement makes the possibility of a work stoppage seem less theoretical and more plausible. What once sounded dramatic now sounds procedural, the next logical step if neither side shifts. The Instagram post didn't just foreshadow tension, it framed the narrative. It told everyone watching exactly how serious the players were, long before formal statements confirmed it.
You watch it till the very end, they're basically saying, like, this is the moment for the players to strike, like, be brave and essentially do it. I don't know how it would go over. I truly don't. I think the sides need to continue to keep talking. And like we've talked about in previous episodes, we're at the point in time now where it seems like the season is going to be delayed. And if I had to guess, I would guess that this season is already delayed. All the reports up until now have said that if they don't get a deal done by the first week in February.
Yet there's an important strategic wrinkle that complicates the comparison. The 1964 NBA players staged their protest at the exact moment it would create maximum pressure, minutes before a nationally televised All-Star game. The timing meant sponsors, broadcasters, and league officials all faced immediate consequences if the dispute wasn't resolved quickly. In negotiation theory, that's considered peak leverage acting when the other side has the most to lose from delay. The present situation unfolds under very different timing conditions. If a strike were to occur now, during the preseason period, there isn't an imminent marquee event to halt. Training camps may not yet be underway, schedules might still be in preparation, and certain league activities may not have reached their most visible stage. Without a live broadcast or major event at risk, the immediate external pressure on league leadership could be lower than in the historical example. That doesn't mean a strike would have no impact. Work stoppages can still disrupt planning, affect sponsorship timelines, and create uncertainty that ripples through an organization. But the scale and speed of that impact often depend on when the action happens. Timing can determine whether a strike feels like an urgent crisis or a slow-burn standoff. For players, deciding when or whether to escalate is therefore both a strategic and symbolic choice. Acting too early might reduce leverage, acting too late might weaken unity or public attention. For the league, the same timeline influences how it calculates risk, compromise, and long-term stability. Both sides must weigh not only what they want, but when pursuing it will be most effective. That's why observers describe the current phase as a delicate chess match rather than a simple dispute. Every statement, proposal, and delay sends signals. Some are intentional, others interpreted. And as the calendar advances, the significance of timing will only grow. Whether negotiations eventually produce agreement or confrontation, one thing is certain: the next moves from either side will shape not just this contract, but the broader narrative of player-league relations for years to come.